Hello everyone, welcome back to the another session in Principles of Programming Languages. We'll continue to learn about 4th unit. The last video we discussed about exception handling. We left with the languages which support exception handling. So this video will cover that. Example languages of exception handling. So what languages exception is handled, how it will be handled, how each design issue what we discussed in the last video, how it is maintained in the languages. That part we'll cover through this video. So in the last video itself I had told you that exception handling is handled. That means exceptions will be handled by 3 languages. Those languages are what? Ada, C++ and Java. So now this video helps you to understand how exception handlers are written in Ada, how it will be maintained, how it will be binded, how it will be the scope of even the exception handler code and raising exception, how it will be. So is all exceptions are solvable, or is there any exception which will be thrown from the code? So these kind of things will get differ from language to language. So that we'll see one by one. Now let's talk about the first programming language which support exception handling, or the first programming language which handle exception. So as slide specified, the language is Ada, but don't conclude that Ada is the first language which handled the exception. No. So basically Ada is drawn from PLI. PLI is a programming language which has the features of exception handling, or exception is handled by PLI language. So the origin of PLI has been incorporated in Ada. Now Ada is handling the exceptions. Right. Now, so how Ada will handle the exceptions, that we'll see through a definition. The frame of an exception handler in Ada, if either a subprogram body, a package body, a task or a block. This is what the definition, how exception handler is defined. Exception handler is defined in a subprogram or in a procedure or in a task or in a block. So as I am specifying the 4 kind of different things, now whether we write in the same area where exception and exception handler, if it is in the different area, so the scope of that exception, will it get carried through the program? That part we'll see. Now let's look at here. Because exception handlers are usually local to the code in which the exception can be raised, they do not have parameters. Now this is important. When the exception is raised in the local body, when I say it is subprogram body, package body, task and block, so when it is inside of the unit, then there won't be any parameter specifically declared to execute that exception handler. If it is outside of it, let's assume that we wrote an exception in somewhere, that it will get occurred in somewhere, exception handling will done in somewhere, then we need a parameter to propagate that this is exception handler, and to get exception to execute here in this block, right? But here we were talking about if exception handle is usually local to the code, then exception can be raised, but we don't have any need of variable. Now, handler form is what? Ada uses handler form as this: exception, when exception name or exception name equal to statement sequences when other statement sequences. So this is what exception handler body we say. Handlers are placed at the end of the block or unit when they occur. So this is what the syntactical structure, how exception handlers are written in Ada programming language. So binding exceptions to handlers. Now let's see how binding exceptions, how binding exception to handlers. If the block or unit in which an exception is raised does not have a handler for that exception, the exception is propagated elsewhere to be handled. So that elsewhere is what? If it is in procedure, will propagate to the caller. If it is block, then we'll propagate it to the scope in which it occurs. If it is occur in a package body, the exception if it is occur in a package body, then it propagate it to the declaration part of the unit that declare the package. And if it is occurred in the task, no propagation. If it has no handler, execute it. In either case, mark it completed. So these are the different areas and different actions what has to be taken by us. Now, the block or unit that raises an exception but doesn't handle it is always terminated. I told you in the beginning of this slide, all the exceptions may be not handled by the languages. If the exceptions are handled, then we'll write a programming syntax to handle that exception. If it is not handled, then we'll simply throw that exception. That means we'll terminate the exception. So that is the case of ADA, and we see how user-defined exceptions are defined in the program. Exception name list, exception, raise exception name. So this is what the syntax to specify the user-defined exception in the ADA language. Then the exception name is not required. If it is in a handler, in this case it propagates the same exception. Exception conditions can be disabled with pragma suppress exception list. So this is what exception condition will get disabled with this syntax structure. Now let's see, predefined exceptions can also be defined. We were seen in the design issue. If predefined defines, how it will get defined. If predefined and user defined both will get defined in the program. So that part we have any design issue. ADA language will support predefined exceptions, user defined exceptions. If you wanted to specify user defined, we'll take that syntax. If it is a predefined, those are 5 types of predefined exceptions. Those are constraint error, numeric error, program error, storage error, tasking error. If it is constraint error, index constraints or range constraints, numericals, numeric operation cannot return a correct value. If it is a program error, call to a subprogram whose body has not been defined or elaborated. Storage error, system runs out of heap. Tasking error, an error associated with the task. So these are what predefined exceptions. If a user defined exception is raised in the program, then we'll specify what kind of exception name it is. So this is what the exception handling in Java, ADA. Now let's look into exception handling in C++. So C++ is also came from the other languages origin to implement these exception handlers. Those languages are what? CLU, ADA and ML. So these languages basically have the origins of exception handlings. So C++ have that feature from these languages. Now this feature has been added to C++ in 1990. C++ exception handlers will take a different form actually. So there in ADA we were seen about the exception handling term, which is when exception raises, when exception choices, that part we were seen in ADA. C++ use a different syntactical structure where it is try, catch. So try is the block that is expected to raise an exception. Catch is a block where we'll handle it. So just like something, we have an exception in the try block, we'll just catch it and we'll handle that and we'll throw it. So that is what try-catch blocks basically contains. So this is what C++ syntactical structure to handle the exception. Now let's understand about the catch function. So catch is the name of all handlers. So when all handlers are having the same catch name, so definitely there will be a problem of overriding. Now overloading. So then when you have a problem of overloading, now to solve the problem of overloading, we'll take a unique name for each catch function or a block. So the formal parameter need not have a variable. It can be simply a type name to distinguish the handler. It is in the form others. The formal parameter can be used to transfer information to the handler. The formal parameter can be an ellipse, in which case it handles the all. So as I specified, catch is the only thing which will be common from each and every exceptions. Exception handler is your catch, right? It will be a common in every language. As it is a common in every program, as it is a common in every language, every program, we have to specify a different formal parameter which is specified in the catch block. Now let's look into Java based on that C++, but more in line with C++, but more in line with OOPS concepts. All exceptions are objects of classes that are descendants of throwable class. Classes of exception. The Java library includes two subclasses of throwable things, which is error and which is exception. Thrown by the Java interpreter for events such as heap overflow, it will be comes under error. Never handled by user programs. So these are what comes under error. Now let's see about exception. User defined exceptions are usually subclasses of this. Has two predefined subclasses, IO exception and runtime exception. So example, array index out of bound exception and null pointer exception. So exceptions in Java will consider as IO exception, input output exception and runtime exception. Now we'll see how these exceptions will get handled. So basically Java exception handlers as same as your C++, like those of C++, except every catch requires a named parameter and all parameters must be descendants of throwable. Syntax of try class is exactly that of C++. So whatever class we were seeing about try and catch, that is exactly same of C++. Exceptions are thrown with throw as in C++, but often the throw includes the new operator. So this is what the new operator. Throw new my exception to create the object. So binding exception to handlers are what? Binding an exception to a handler is simpler in Java than it is in C++. So an exception is bound to the first handler with a parameter is the same class as the thrown object or an ancestor of it. So it is as simple as, right? So we were seeing in C++ in a different manner. So Java is very simple to implement or to handle the exceptions. An exception can be handled and rethrown by including a throw in the handler. A handler could also be throw a different exception. And if no handler is found in the method, the exception is propagated to the method's caller. If no handler is found all the way to main, the program is terminated. So that's what we learn even in C++. If exception is not being handled, we'll throw that exception. To ensure that all exceptions are caught, a handler can be included in any try construct that catches the exceptions. Simply use an exception class parameter. Of course, it must be the last in the try construct. There are two kinds of exceptions in Java, which are checked and unchecked exceptions. The Java throws class is quite different from the throw class of C++. Exceptions of class error and runtime exception and all of their descendants are called unchecked exceptions. It is important. It came for 2 marks question in the last year paper. All other exceptions are called checked exceptions. We were just dividing into two categories, checked and unchecked exceptions. Checked exceptions that may be thrown by a method must be either listed in the throws class or handled in the method. So these are what two classes, two exceptions what basically handled by the Java. So a method cannot declare more exceptions in its throws class than the method it overrides. A method that calls a method that lists a particular checked exception in its throw class has 3 alternatives for dealing with that exception. Catch and handle the exception. So catch is the place where we'll handle the exception. Try is the place to specify the what kind of exception. Catch the exception and throw an exception that is listed in the own throws class. Declare it in its throws class and do not handle it. The finally class can appear at the end of try construct. So this is what finally class. Purpose is what? To specify code that is to be executed regardless of what happens in the try construct. So that's what we use the final construct. Now this is what the example. Now you can see the example. So the way how we have to write the exception in the try block. Then we will write the thing which is not covered in the try block, that will be handled in finally class. The handle of exception or exception handling will be done basically in catch clause. If the exception is not being handled by the catch block, then we'll throw that exception. So this is about Java, how exception handlings will be done. So this video will help you out to understand about exception handling things in Ada, C++ and Java. Thank you all.